Remember those halcyon days, say, a month or two ago, when free time was something we craved? Now most of us, and we're the lucky ones, have oceans of free time for the indefinite future. It's come under the worst of circumstances, an enforced break, not a vacation. Still, there are hours to kill and hours to fill. And while there are no tennis matches, there are tennis books. Lots of them. It's George Plimpton who served up the small ball theory when it comes to sports and literature. Namely, the smaller the ball, the better the book. There are entire libraries of great baseball books. There are not many great football books. Well, that in mind, consider that a tennis ball is smaller than a baseball. Here are 5 tennis books to get you going. String Theory by David Foster Wallace. The author, who died in 2008, might be best known in tennis circles for his glowing profile of Roger Federer, but it was far from the only time he wrote about tennis, as evidenced by this collection. Courts of Babylon by Peter Boda. Tennis doesn't always come off so well in this book of essays from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, covering everyone from Chris and Martina to, in my favorite piece, a reflection of Bjorn Borg's comeback. 3. A Handful of Summers by Gordon Forbes. A South African player in the 50s and 60s, Forbes wrote this memoir, often very funny, about the characters barnstorming the world with a racket before the Open era. 4. Open. Andre Agassi's book, co-written with J.R. Moringer, is the standard bearer for the sports memoir. Honest, profound, and often witheringly self-critical. 5. Levels of the Game. John McPhee uses a match at Forest Hills between Arthur Ashe and Clark Graebner to discuss everything from the players and their background to the economics of tennis to the mechanics of hitting a ball. Later, other tennis writers would try and emulate this. That ought to carve into your free time. We'll do another round, a sequel as it were, later in the break.
And John is with us along with the rest of the crew here. And just to your point about Andre's autobiography, Open, I mean, for a guy who started out under the heading Image is Everything, I think that took a lot of people by surprise that there was so much substance and candor from Andre in that book.
Yeah, I think this was vintage Andre, which was, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it right. So apparently it took him a while to get to that point. But once he liked that author from having read a nonfiction book by him, The Tender Bar, and Andre said, that's my guy. And once Andre committed, he was all in. And again, every single memoir now is, I want this to be like the Agassi book. This is the GOAT of sports memoirs.
John's list kind of reminds us that you could really make a pretty decent library out of all the tennis books that have been written over the years. I'll ask the panel for sort of a favorite tennis book that they've read. Nolsey, what's yours?
Well, I'm feeling really honored right now because I made John's top 5 list there. My favorite book by far is A Handful of Summers by Gordon Forbes. It talks about his journey with his doubles partner, Abe Siegel, and it's about their journeys back in the day, the good old stories. And, it brings back memories for me because my first introduction to tennis, my parents used to run like little money tournaments here in the Bahamas when I was younger. And they would have Fred Stolle, Rod Laver, Roy Emerson. They'd have all the characters and they would tell us similar stories of how the band kind of traveled the circuit back in the day. So this one really stood out for me.
Very fascinating that your folks were involved in that barnstorming history. Prakash, what's your favorite tennis book?
I'm going to pick a couple with 2 different tones. Vijay put out a book in the 90s, which did very well all through the UK and in India. It was in tone largely dedicated mostly towards children. Vijay was very sick as a child, diagnosed with TB, actually, had very, very bad asthma. So it was really an inspirational book for children to be able to sort of overcome all of their challenges. And, he said he really did it just with the love of his parents. So for those reasons, I really, really loved that. And on a completely different tone, I loved Boris Becker's book, which was called The Player. Now, for me, he was, the guy when I was growing up. It was boom, boom. He was just my favorite. So for him to be able to get open and really kind of let us into what goes on in his mind, what really changed in his world as a teenager to becoming a superstar. Again, similar to Andre, he was very, candid. And I've read that multiple times, actually.
Very nice. And we saw that Richard Evans was the co-writer on your dad's book. We tipped the cap to that great journalist. John, what's yours?
Oh, man. I guess I've got to go with Levels of the Game by John McPhee, which I just think is so elegant. John McPhee, longtime New Yorker writer who's written about everything from orange groves to Bill Bradley to the headmaster of his prep school. I actually had the good fortune of teaching a semester at Princeton with John McPhee. And, Roger Federer, Serena Williams, LeBron James, no problem. But I would see John McPhee and I would turn into this sort of nervous kid and stammer and get sweaty palmed. I mean, to me, he is just such an elegant, efficient, graceful writer. He's a lovely guy. And again, this is sort of a simple book. It's probably only maybe 50,000 words, 125 pages, but it's just a beautiful, beautiful tennis book.
Here, here. I'm going to throw out two books that I love. The first is Hard Courts by John Feinstein, which was a behind-the-scenes look of a complete ATP Tour season in 1990. John got great access, and that was a year that had some pretty fascinating characters in men's tennis. So do... Oh, and you can get an autographed copy at Borders if there's even such a thing as Borders anymore. And, of course, the other book is, and I just want to get the title right, it's by a bloke named L. John Wertheim. I still don't know what the L stands for. It's called Strokes of Genius. Apparently, this author, Prakash, is a TV guy who dabbles in print writing. It chronicles a pretty good match at Wimbledon about a decade ago.
I've come across his work now and then. Habes, the guy knows what he's talking about.
Usually.
You didn't mention you didn't mention this was adapted for a Tennis Channel documentary, but no, you talked about serious point. You talked about the access John Feinstein got. This really is as much about Roger and Rafa as it is the writer. They were so gracious and so generous with their time and recollections. I had the easy job. They had to play the five-set match. I just had to slap a few words around it.
By the way, for anybody born in the 90s or earlier, a book is that thing that has two covers on either end and words in the middle that you can hold in your hand. John